I just got a phone call. And it was like, I think it was like that for everyone. It was just so horrific. You couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in.
The Beatles were on top of the world. But a storm was gathering, and it wasn't Yoko Ono or creative differences that would finally tear them apart. It was one man. A man Paul McCartney instantly despised. A man he saw as a destructive force. Who would become the catalyst to shatter everything they had built? This is the story of how McCartney's bitter opposition to one man led to the end of the greatest band in history. So how could one man topple a musical empire? Well, to understand that, you have to know that by late 1967, the empire was already on fragile ground. The Beatles were a global phenomenon, a cultural force like no other. But behind the scenes, the four men who made up the group were lost without their anchor. On August 27, 1967, their manager, Brian Epstein, died of an accidental overdose. Epstein wasn't just a manager, he was often called the fifth Beatle. He was the one who discovered them in a sweaty Liverpool cellar, polished their image, and masterminded their business moves. He was their friend, their guide, and the guardian of their finances. And just like that, he was gone. In the void he left, chaos started to creep in. For all their musical genius, the Beatles were admittedly naive about business. John Lennon later confessed that before Epstein's death, their financial affairs were a total mystery. They were artists, not accountants, and they were about to learn a brutal lesson about what happens when art and money collide without a referee. Their first attempt to steer their own ship was a utopian and ultimately disastrous venture called Apple Corps. The idea, pushed mainly by Paul McCartney, was to create a multimedia company to help other struggling artists. It was a hippie dream, a creative sanctuary funded by the biggest band on the planet. They opened Apple Publishing, Apple Films, and a short-lived Apple boutique in London. Their famous ads, asking aspiring artists to send in their work, led to an avalanche of tapes, manuscripts, and, as John put it, every freak in the world showing up at their Savile Row headquarters looking for a handout. The problem was, this beautiful, chaotic dream was a financial nightmare. Money was pouring out of Apple Corps with zero accountability. The boutique was run by friends and family with more idealism than experience. A mystic known as Magic Alex was given a division called Apple Electronics and burned through a fortune on wild, unworkable inventions. By late 1968, an accountant sent a desperate letter to each Beatle, warning them they were in terrible financial trouble. John Lennon summed it up bluntly. "If it carries on like this, all of us will be broke in 6 months." The kingdom was leaderless, bleeding cash, and on the brink of collapse. The Beatles needed a savior. They needed a firm hand. But the man who answered the call wasn't the savior they hoped for. For Paul McCartney, he was the devil in disguise, and his arrival would kickstart the final ugly chapter of the Beatles' story. To his clients, Klein was a miracle worker. To record labels, he was a pit bull. Born in New Jersey and partly raised. In an orphanage, Klein was a self-made street fighter with a brilliant mind for numbers and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. He even had a parody of the 23rd Psalm on his desk that read, "Though I walk in the valley of the shadow of evil, I have no fear, as I am the biggest bastard in the valley." He'd made his name not by nurturing artists, but by auditing record companies. With a predatory zeal, he'd dig through their books and find the money they were hiding from his clients. He did it for Sam Cooke, Bobby Darin, and the Animals. He was the guy you hired to screw the record company for a change, and artists loved him for it. In 1965, he managed his biggest coup yet. He got the Rolling Stones a staggering $125 million advance from Decca Records, an unheard-of sum at the time. He became their manager, and his power in the industry skyrocketed. But Klein's methods had a dark side. His contracts were notoriously complex. That huge advance for the Stones, it went into a company Klein himself owned, and the fine print. meant he didn't have to pay the band for 20 years. He didn't just manage artists, he created corporate structures that often gave him ownership of the music itself. By the time the Beatles were considering him, the Stones were already suing him, accusing him of withholding royalties and stealing their publishing rights. Mick Jagger, once a client, was now a sworn enemy. Klein had wanted the Beatles for years. He'd even tried to approach Brian Epstein back in 1964, but Epstein, loyal to EMI, showed him the door. But now, with Epstein gone and Apple hemorrhaging cash, Klein saw his chance. He read John Lennon's desperate quote about being broke and made his move. On January 26, 1969, he met with John and Yoko. Klein was a master of seduction. Knowing their diet, he had a special macrobiotic meal prepared. He wasn't some stuffy executive. He was from the streets, he spoke their language, and he knew their music inside and out. John Lennon, feeling increasingly sidelined in the band, was completely won over. He saw Klein as a fellow rebel who would fight their battles. After that first meeting, John hired Klein as his personal financial representative. John's endorsement was huge. George Harrison and Ringo Starr, often feeling like junior partners, were also impressed. Klein gave them a level of respect they felt they didn't always get. Ringo would later recall thinking, "It'll be good to have a con man who is on our side." But one Beatle wasn't charmed. One Beatles bullshit detector was screaming. Paul McCartney had already been warned. Mick Jagger had sent a simple, stark message: don't go near him. Paul saw a bully and a shark. He didn't trust Klein's promises or his reputation. As he later put it, he saw a kind of demon that haunted his dreams. The battle lines were drawn. The four-headed monster was about to split down the middle. It would be John, George, and Ringo on one side, and Paul McCartney all alone on the other. The fight over Alan Klein wasn't just about business. It became a proxy war for every resentment that had been simmering for years. At its core was a clash between two very different men, Alan Klein and Lee Eastman. While the others were falling for Klein, Paul had his own candidate in mind, Lee Eastman, a highly respected New York entertainment lawyer. He was experienced, he was professional, and most importantly, he was the father of Linda Eastman, the photographer Paul had just married. To Paul, the choice was a no-brainer. Eastman was family, he was trustworthy. But to the other Beatles, bringing in Paul's father-in-law looked like a power grab. They worried Eastman would naturally favor Paul, cementing his perceived dominance in the group. It was an understandable fear, but one that would lead to disaster. The tension exploded in a series of nasty meetings. On one side was Klein, the street-smart accountant promising to smash the system. On the other was Eastman, the polished corporate lawyer advocating a more cautious approach. Klein played on the other's insecurities brilliantly. He painted Eastman as part of the establishment that was ripping them off and implied Paul was trying to use his father-in-law to screw them over. The choice became symbolic. Klein was John's guy, the rebel. Eastman was Paul's guy, the suit. George and Ringo sided with John. Paul was horrified. He pleaded with them, pointing to Klein's history with the Stones, the lawsuits, the stolen rights, but his protests just looked self-serving. The more he fought against Klein, the more the others saw it as a fight for his father-in-law, and the deeper they dug in. The final decision came down to a vote. John, George, and Ringo voted for Alan Klein. Paul was outvoted, 3-1. On May 8, 1969, John, George, and Ringo signed a contract making Klein the business manager of the Beatles, with a 20% cut of their earnings. Paul McCartney refused to sign. He publicly stated, "He is definitely the manager of John, George, and Ringo, but I have asked him and I have told him that he doesn't manage me." It was a defiant, lonely stand. But in the legal partnership of the Beatles, the majority ruled. Klein was in. Paul was now legally tied to a man he despised, a man his bandmates had chosen over him. This wasn't a business disagreement anymore. It was a betrayal that created a chasm in the band, and Alan Klein stood right in the middle of it. Once in charge, Alan Klein moved with brutal efficiency. His first job was to do exactly what he promised: clean house at Apple Corps. He descended on the free-spending company like a warlord, firing friends, hangers-on, and mystics who were draining the bank account. The hippie dream was over. To John, George, and Ringo, this was exactly what they wanted. Klein was the tough boss they couldn't be. He was saving them from themselves. Klein's masterstroke was renegotiating the Beatles' contract with EMI and Capitol Records. He used his trademark aggression to get them the highest royalty rate ever paid to an artist at the time, a reported 69 cents per album. This was a real, tangible victory. It was proof that Klein delivered. But Paul watched all this with a growing sense of dread. While Klein was trimming the fat, he was also consolidating his own power. In a deliberate show of dominance, Klein once snubbed Paul on the phone in front of his staff, refusing to take his call. Their direct communication was effectively over. From that point on, the Cold War between them simmered through the band's final fractured year, while the others saw but incredibly lucrative detail for Klein. The tension bled into their creative work. The band was falling apart. Paul, feeling the group slipping away, tried to rally them for one last back-to-basics project called Get Back. The filmed sessions, in January 1969, were notoriously tense, and the project was shelved. The band managed to pull together for one last masterpiece, Abbey Road. But the Get Back tapes sat in a vault, an unfinished postscript. It was Alan Klein who saw the potential in those forgotten tapes. He decided they could be turned into a final Beatles album and film, one more massive payday. He brought in the legendary and eccentric producer Phil Spector to tidy up the tapes, choosing Spector, a man famous for his grand orchestral wall of sound, to work on an album conceived as raw and live was a bizarre decision, and it would lead to the single greatest musical insult of Paul McCartney's career. The Get Back project was Paul McCartney's baby. His vision was clear: no studio tricks, no overdubs, just the four of them playing as a band. It was supposed, to be honest, a return to their stripped-down rock and roll roots. In early 1970, with the Beatles effectively broken up, Alan Klein took control of the tapes, renaming the project Let It Be. He handed the recordings to Phil Spector. John Lennon, who had once insisted on the no overdubs rule, gave Spector his blessing. Paul, isolated and working on his first solo album, was mostly kept in the dark. He found out what happened in the worst way possible. In April 1970, an acetate of the final album was delivered to him. As he listened, his disbelief turned to rage. Spector hadn't just tidied up the tracks, he'd buried them under syrupy orchestration. The most offensive part, in Paul's eyes, was what he did to The Long and Winding Road. What was once a sparse, piano-led ballad had been transformed. Without consulting Paul, Spector had slathered on a 50-piece orchestra, a 14-voice female choir, and soaring harps. To Paul, it was musical vandalism. He was furious. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just by Klein and Spector, but by his bandmates, who let it happen. He later said he was sent a version with harps, horns, an orchestra, and women's choir added. No one had asked me what I thought. I couldn't believe it. Their original producer, George Martin, was equally appalled, suggesting the credit should read, "Produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector." Paul immediately fired off a blistering letter to Klein at Apple demanding changes. The harp had to go. The orchestral and choir levels had to be reduced. He ended with a defiant command. Don't do it again. Klein's response was silence. The demands were ignored. The album was released as it was. This was the final, humiliating proof of Paul's powerlessness. Alan Klein now had control over his music. He could take a song Paul wrote and warp it into something he hated, and there was nothing he could do. The incident with the long and winding road was the point of no return. It was the final push that would lead him to make the most painful decision of his life: to sue his own bandmates. It was the only way he could see to kill the beast that had taken over his band. For months, Paul McCartney was trapped. His band was gone, but the legal entity, the Beatles and Covers, remained, with Alan Klein as its manager. This meant Klein got a cut of everything Paul earned, even from his solo albums. He felt like he'd spent his life building an empire, only to see it fall into the hands of a man he loathed. He wanted to sue Alan Klein directly, but his lawyers told him he couldn't. Klein's contract was with the Beatles partnership. The only way to get rid of Klein was to dissolve the partnership itself. To do that, he was told, "You've got to sue the Beatles." The thought was agonizing. Suing John, George, and Ringo, his brothers, his creative partners, his entire world. For years, Paul was cast as the villain who broke up the Beatles. He admitted he even bought into that narrative himself for a while, but he felt he had no other choice. It was a horrendous decision, but the alternative was letting Klein own them. "There was no way I was going to work that hard for all my life and see it all vanish in a puff of smoke," he later explained. He believed if he didn't act, the entire Beatles' legacy would be consumed by Klein. On December 31, 1970, Paul McCartney filed a lawsuit in London's High Court of Justice seeking the formal dissolution of the Beatles partnership. He argued that the band no longer existed and their finances were being mismanaged by Klein, citing the Let It Be album as a key example. He asked the court to appoint a neutral receiver to take over their finances, wresting control from Klein. The court case was brutal, playing out in the public eye. Affidavits were filed. John, George, and Ringo painted Paul as a prima donna who was angry he didn't get his way. They defended Klein, arguing he'd saved them from ruin. Paul detailed his deep distrust of Klein and the 3-against-1 dynamic. That left him powerless. But in March 1971, Paul McCartney won. The judge ruled in his favor, agreeing that the level of mistrust made the business relationship impossible. A receiver was appointed, and Alan Klein's grip on the Beatles' empire was officially broken. To the world, it looked like the day Paul legally ended the Beatles. But in Paul's mind, it was the day he saved them. He had taken on the role of the villain to slay the dragon. Now, all he could do was wait for his former friends to realize the man they'd championed was no hero. With the court's decision, Paul was finally free. He was no longer shackled to Alan Klein. But for John, George, and Ringo, the story wasn't over. They continued to be managed by Klein for their solo careers. But as time passed, the very things Paul had warned them about started coming true. George Harrison was the first to feel the bite. He'd organized the groundbreaking concert for Bangladesh in 1971 to raise money for refugees. Klein handled the business side, but due to issues with how the event's charity status was handled, the IRS got involved and millions of dollars meant for starving refugees were tied up in tax disputes for years. George was furious. His noble effort was tarnished by financial controversy under Klein's watch. John Lennon grew disillusioned, too. He felt Klein was unsupportive of his more political work with Yoko Ono. The last straw may have been hearing that Klein had allegedly blocked Yoko from performing at the Bangladesh concert. The man he saw as a kindred spirit now just seemed like another suit. It also became clear that Klein's contracts were designed to enrich himself just as much as his clients. That incredible royalty rate came with his 20% commission taken from their total earnings, a point of major contention in Paul's lawsuit. The remaining Beatles began to realize they'd made a deal with the devil, and the devil always collects. By early 1973, the alliance was in tatters. John, George, and Ringo gave notice they wouldn't be renewing Klein's contract. Klein's response was predictable. He sued them. He sued the Beatles and Apple for $19 million. The legal battles dragged on until 1977, with Klein walking away with a final settlement of around $5 million. The empire Klein built on the ashes of their friendship had crumbled into lawsuits. Just as he had with the Rolling Stones, he fell, out with the remaining Beatles. The charm had worn off, and the street fighter was just demanding his cut. In the years after the ugly split with Alan Klein, a quiet but profound shift occurred. One by one, the men who had championed him began to admit the uncomfortable truth. In a 1973 interview, as his own relationship with Klein fell apart, John Lennon made a stunning admission. When asked about the lawsuit, he said, "Let's say possibly, Paul's suspicions were right, and the timing was right." Coming from John, Paul's fiercest rival, it was a monumental concession. He even went on to write the song Steel and Glass in 1974, a scathing takedown widely believed to be aimed at Klein. George Harrison, once furious about Paul's in-laws, was now suing Klein himself over the Bangladesh funds. And Ringo Starr, years later, said it plainly. Paul was right as usual. It was the ultimate vindication for Paul McCartney. The men who had outvoted him, sided against him, and watched him get vilified in the press finally saw what he had seen all along. They had to walk through the fire with Klein to understand the burns. Paul's deep distrust of Klein wasn't just a personality clash. It was instinct. He saw a predator where his friends saw a protector, and his horrendous decision to sue them was, in the long run, an act of preservation. As Paul himself later reflected, the only way for me to save the Beatles and Apple was to sue the band. If I hadn't done that, it would have all belonged to Alan Klein. He realized that by playing the bastard who sued his mates, he had saved their collective legacy. That lawsuit ensured their master tapes stayed in their control and that future projects like the anthology series could even exist. The story of Alan Klein and the Beatles is a dark chapter in music history. It's a story of how business can poison art. Klein didn't single-handedly break up the Beatles. The cracks were already there, but his presence was a wedge, driving them deeper until the whole thing shattered. He turned brother against brother, using their insecurities to his own advantage. Paul McCartney's intense personal hatred of the man was the band's only defense. It forced him into painful isolation, but gave him the clarity to see the danger when others were blinded. He fought a war he never wanted, and for a while lost the PR battle. But history has proven him right. His lawsuit wasn't the final blow that destroyed the Beatles.